I never thought a bag of ice melt would land someone in handcuffs. But here we are, standing in my driveway on a freezing February morning in Minneapolis, Minnesota, watching the police load Patricia Hendricks into the back of a squad car while she screams about property rights and community standards. Let me back up. My name is Gregory Walsh, and I moved into the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision about 8 months ago. The house was perfect, a charming 2-story colonial with a decent yard, and the price was right. What nobody told me during the closing was that the homeowners association was run by a woman who made Mussolini look easygoing. Patricia Hendricks was 53 years old, had that distinctive Karen haircut you see in memes, the kind that defies both gravity and good taste. And she took her position as HOA president more seriously than most people take national security. She lived 3 houses down from me in a pristine white colonial that looked like it had never experienced a single day of actual human habitation. Her lawn was always perfectly manicured, even under 2 feet of snow, and her holiday decorations went up exactly on the 1st of December and came down precisely on January 2nd. I should have known. I was in trouble the first week I moved in. I had just finished unloading the last box from the moving truck when Patricia appeared at my door, clipboard in hand, wearing a pressed pantsuit despite the 90-degree August heat. She introduced herself with a smile that never reached her eyes and handed me a 70-page HOA handbook. "Welcome to Meadowbrook Estates," she said, her voice saccharine sweet. "I'm sure you'll find our community standards to be quite comprehensive. Please review sections 3 through 12 regarding lawn maintenance, sections 15 through 21 about exterior paint colors, and sections 34 through 40 regarding proper waste disposal protocols." I thanked her, set the handbook on my kitchen counter, and promptly forgot about it for 3 weeks until I received my first violation notice. Apparently, my mailbox was 4 inches too tall according to subsection 8.3.2 of the community standards. The fine was $50. I paid it and cut down my mailbox. The second violation came in October when I put up Halloween decorations. According to Patricia, inflatable decorations were prohibited under section 22.7, and my 6-foot ghost needed to come down immediately. I complied, but I was starting to get irritated. The third violation, the Christmas lights incident, almost pushed me over the edge. I had strung up white icicle lights along my roofline, nothing crazy, just simple and tasteful. Patricia cited me for using the wrong shade of white. Apparently, only warm white was acceptable, not cool white. The fine was $75. I paid it through gritted teeth. But the ice melt situation, that was something else entirely. Minnesota winters are brutal. We're talking sub-zero temperatures, wind chills that make your face hurt, and ice everywhere. After a particularly nasty February storm dumped 8 inches of freezing rain followed by sleet, I knew I needed to stock up on ice melt. The problem was that everyone else in Minneapolis had the same idea, and every hardware store within a 20-mile radius was sold out. I spent 3 days calling around before I finally found a specialty chemical supply company called Nordic Solutions that had industrial-grade ice melt in stock. The owner, a guy named Tom, explained that they normally sold to commercial clients, but he could make an exception if I bought in bulk. "I've got this custom batch we just manufactured," Tom said over the phone. "It's a calcium chloride and magnesium chloride blend with a blue dye tracer and a special anti-caking agent we developed in-house. Works down to -40 degrees. I can sell you 100 pounds for $200. It was expensive, but I was desperate. My driveway was a skating rink, and I had nearly broken my ankle trying to get to my car that morning. I drove to their warehouse in an industrial area near the airport and picked up two 50-pound bags. Tom walked me through the specs while loading the bags into my trunk. Each batch has a unique identifier code, he explained, pointing to a series of numbers stamped on the bag. It's for quality control and traceability. This particular batch is NS 2024-473B. We keep detailed records of every sale. I thanked him, took the bags home, and immediately started spreading the ice melt on my driveway and front walkway. The stuff worked like magic. Within 20 minutes, the ice was melting away, leaving dry pavement in its wake. I used about 30 pounds that first day and stored the rest in my garage. The next morning, I woke up to find my driveway covered in ice again. Not just a little ice, mind you, but a solid sheet of the stuff, like someone had flooded it overnight and let it freeze. I walked out to investigate, and that's when I noticed something odd. My bags of ice melt were gone. I had left them right inside my garage near the door. The garage had been closed but not locked, and someone had clearly come in and taken both bags. I checked my security camera, but the angle didn't cover that part of the garage. All I could see was a shadowy figure entering around 3 in the morning, too dark and grainy to identify. I was furious. That ice melt had cost me $200, and now I was back to square one with an impassable driveway. I posted about the theft on the neighborhood Facebook group, hoping someone had seen something. Within minutes, Patricia commented, "Perhaps if you had properly secured your garage, this wouldn't have happened," she wrote. "This is exactly why we have community standards about keeping garage doors closed at all times. I'll be filing a violation report." I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Not only had someone stolen my ice melt, but now Patricia was threatening me with another fine for being the victim of theft. Over the next few days, I noticed something interesting. Several driveways in the neighborhood were suddenly pristine and ice-free, despite the continued cold snap and additional snow. Most notably, Patricia's driveway looked like it had been professionally treated. The ice was completely gone, and there was a distinctive blue tint to the areas where ice melt had been applied, blue tint. Just like the ice melt I had bought from Nordic Solutions, I started paying closer attention. Patricia's walkway was clear. Her front steps were clear. Even the sidewalk in front of her house extended about 30 feet in either direction, was completely ice-free, and showed that same blue tint. Then I noticed her neighbor, Barbara Mitchell, also had a pristine driveway with blue-tinted pavement. And Doug Sanders, 2 houses down from me, same thing. All 3 of them were on the HOA board with Patricia. I called Tom at Nordic Solutions. "Hey, this is Gregory Walsh. I bought that custom ice melt from you last week. I have a weird question. Is there any way to test if ice melt came from a specific batch?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual request. Is there a problem with the product?" "No, the product is great. It's just that someone stole my bags and I think I might have found where they ended up." "Can the batch number be traced somehow?" "Absolutely," Tom said. "The blue dye we use is actually a proprietary formula that we can identify under UV light. Plus, our anti-caking agent has a unique chemical signature. If you can get me a sample of the ice melt you think is yours, I can test it against the batch records." I grabbed some Ziploc bags and walked down to Patricia's house that evening, scraping up some of the blue-tinted slush from her driveway while pretending to tie my shoe. I did the same at Barbara's house and Doug's house, being as casual and inconspicuous as possible. The next morning, I drove back to Nordic Solutions with my samples. Tom took them into the lab while I waited in the office, drinking terrible coffee and trying not to get my hopes up. 40 minutes later, Tom emerged with a printout. "This is definitely your ice melt," he said, pointing to the chemical analysis. "All 3 samples match batch NS 2024-473B exactly. The dye signature is identical, and the anti-caking agent is a perfect match. There's no question about it." I felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger. Patricia had stolen from me. The HOA president, the woman who fined me for mailbox heights and Christmas light colors, was a thief. "Can you document this officially?" I asked. "I'm going to need proof if I'm going to confront her." Tom printed out a detailed report with the chemical analysis, batch numbers, and a signed statement confirming that the samples I provided matched the ice melt sold exclusively to me. He also included a copy of the receipt showing the purchase date and the unique batch identifier. I thanked him profusely and headed home, my mind racing with how to handle this. My first instinct was to call the police, but I wanted to try confronting Patricia directly first. Maybe there was some explanation, however unlikely. Maybe she had found the bags by the side of the road and didn't realize they were stolen. Maybe she had bought similar ice melt from somewhere else. I walked down to her house that afternoon and rang the doorbell. Patricia answered wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and an expression of mild annoyance. "Gregory," she said. "What can I do for you?" "Hi, Patricia. I wanted to talk to you about the ice melt on your driveway." Her expression didn't change. "What about it?" "I noticed it has a distinctive blue tint, same as the industrial-grade ice melt that was stolen from my garage last week." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. I purchased ice melt from a hardware store like everyone else." "Really?" "Because I had my ice melt tested, and it's a custom batch with a unique identifier. I also tested the ice melt on your driveway, and it's a perfect match." For just a second, I saw panic flash across her face before she composed herself. "That's ridiculous. You're accusing me of theft based on some pseudoscience. This is harassment, Gregory. I'm going to file a complaint with the HOA board." "You are the HOA board, Patricia, or at least the president of it. And I have documentation from the chemical supply company confirming that the ice melt on your driveway and on Barbara's and Doug's driveways all came from the batch that was sold exclusively to me." Patricia's face was turning red now. "Get off my property. This conversation is over." "I'm going to the police, Patricia. You stole $200 worth of ice melt from my garage and I have proof." "You have nothing," she snapped. "Some numbers on a piece of paper don't prove anything. Now leave before I call the police myself." I left, but I was more determined than ever. If Patricia wanted to play hardball, I could play hardball. I drove to the Minneapolis Police Department 3rd Precinct Station and filed a formal theft report. The officer who took my statement, a tired-looking guy in his 40s named Officer Martinez, listened to my story with a mixture of interest and skepticism. "So you're saying the HOA president stole ice melt from your garage, and you can prove it based on a batch number?" "Not just a batch number," I said, sliding Tom's report across the desk. "Chemical analysis. The ice melt on her property is an exact match to the ice melt that was sold exclusively to me. The company keeps detailed records of every sale, and I'm the only person in Minnesota who bought this specific batch." Officer Martinez reviewed the documents, his eyebrows rising as he read through the analysis. "This is actually pretty thorough, and you have samples from her property." 3 properties, actually. Patricia Hendricks, Barbara Mitchell, and Doug Sanders. All of them are on the HOA board, and all of them have the same ice melt on their driveways. Officer Martinez nodded slowly. "Okay, Let me make some calls. If this documentation checks out, we'll follow up with Miss Hendricks. I left the station feeling cautiously optimistic. At the very least, Patricia would have to answer some uncomfortable questions. 2 days later, I got a call from Officer Martinez asking me to come down to the station. When I arrived, he ushered me into a small conference room where a detective was waiting. Detective Sarah Chen was sharp-eyed and professional, and she had my case files spread out on the table. Mr. Walsh, I've reviewed your theft report and the supporting documentation you provided. I also contacted Nordic Solutions to verify the batch records. Everything checks out. The ice melt on Patricia Hendricks' property is definitively from the batch sold to you. I felt a surge of relief. So what happens now? Well, here's where it gets interesting, Detective Chen said. We executed a search warrant on Miss Hendricks' property this morning. We found the empty bags from your ice melt in her garage, stuffed in the back of a storage cabinet. The batch numbers on the bags match the documentation you provided. So she definitely stole it, without question. But there's more. We also found documentation suggesting that Miss Hendricks has been systematically filing false HOA violations against residents and pocketing the fine money. She's been running a scheme for at least 2 years, generating somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 in fraudulent fines. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Are you serious? Completely serious. We contacted the other members of the HOA board, and they were unaware of the extent of the fraud. Apparently, Patricia handled all the financial records herself and provided falsified reports at board meetings. Barbara Mitchell and Doug Sanders thought they were receiving legitimate ice melt that Patricia had purchased for board members using HOA funds. They had no idea it was stolen from you. So what charges is Patricia facing? Detective Chen consulted her notes. Theft, obviously. That's the ice melt. But also embezzlement, fraud, and forgery related to the HOA violations and financial records. The county prosecutor is reviewing the case, but we're looking at multiple felony charges. I should have felt victorious, but mostly I just felt tired. All of this over a bag of ice melt. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Patricia was arrested and charged with 1 count of 4th-degree theft for the ice melt, 3 counts of felony theft by swindle for the embezzlement, and multiple counts of forgery. The story made the local news, and suddenly, my quiet suburban subdivision was crawling with reporters wanting to know about the HOA president who got caught because of a batch number on ice melt. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Patricia from her position. They also voted to refund all fines issued over the past 2 years, pending a review of their legitimacy. I got my $50 back for the mailbox, my $75 back for the Christmas lights, and a formal apology for the Halloween decoration fine. Barbara Mitchell, who took over as interim president, came to my house personally to apologize. I had no idea, she said, looking genuinely distressed. Patricia told us she had purchased ice melt in bulk from a commercial supplier at a discount for board members. We thought she was being generous. If I had known it was stolen, especially from you. I believed her. Barbara had always been pleasant to me, and she seemed mortified by the whole situation. The criminal case moved forward surprisingly quickly. Patricia's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested in being lenient. The evidence was overwhelming, and the chemical analysis from Nordic Solutions was airtight. In late April, Patricia pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommended sentence rather than going to trial. I attended the sentencing hearing in early May. The courtroom was packed with residents from Meadowbrook Estates, many of whom had been victims of Patricia's fraudulent fines. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Judge Kathleen Morrison, reviewed the case file with a stony expression. Patricia's lawyer made a brief statement asking for leniency, citing Patricia's previous clean record and her contributions to the community. The prosecutor countered with a detailed accounting of Patricia's fraud, emphasizing the breach of trust and the systematic nature of her crimes. When it was time for sentencing, Judge Morrison didn't mince words. "Miss Hendricks, you held a position of trust within your community, and you abused that trust for personal gain. You stole from your neighbor. You embezzled funds from the homeowners association. You falsified documents and created fake violations to extract money from people who trusted you to act in their best interests. This court takes such breaches of fiduciary duty very seriously." Patricia stood with her lawyer, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she had aged 10 years since I last saw her. "I am sentencing you to 18 months in the Hennepin County Workhouse for the theft and embezzlement charges, followed by 3 years of probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, totaling $42,300, which includes the $200 for the stolen ice melt. You are also prohibited from serving on any homeowners association board or in any position of fiduciary trust during your probation period." Patricia started crying, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "I want to be clear about something, Miss Hendricks. This isn't about ice melt. This is about integrity. This is about the fact that when you were entrusted with authority over your neighbors, you chose to exploit that authority for personal enrichment. The fact that you were ultimately caught because of a batch number on a bag of ice melt doesn't make your actions any less reprehensible. It just makes them more traceable." The gavel came down, and Patricia was led out of the courtroom by a bailiff. I watched her go, feeling a complicated mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This woman had made my life miserable for months over trivial violations, and in the end, she had destroyed her own life over greed and control. Life in Meadowbrook Estates changed dramatically after Patricia's arrest. Barbara took over as HOA president and immediately instituted reforms. The 70-page handbook was condensed to a reasonable 20 pages, focusing on genuinely important community standards, rather than arbitrary rules about mailbox heights and Christmas light colors. The board implemented transparent financial reporting with quarterly audits by an independent accountant, and they established an appeals process for violations, so residents couldn't be arbitrarily fined without recourse. I got my $200 back for the ice melt as part of the restitution order, along with the money from the fraudulent fines. More importantly, I could finally relax in my own home without worrying about the HOA police showing up with clipboards and measuring tapes. The news coverage was extensive, but eventually died down. For a few weeks, I was known as the ice melt guy, and neighbors I'd never spoken to before would stop me on walks to ask about the case. A few national news outlets picked up the story because of the unusual nature of the evidence. Apparently, using chemical batch analysis to trace stolen ice melt was novel enough to be interesting to crime reporters. Tom from Nordic Solutions called me about a month after the sentencing to let me know that the case had been great for his business. Apparently, several other municipalities and commercial clients had reached out wanting to purchase ice melt with traceable batch numbers for security purposes. He offered me a lifetime discount on any products I needed, which I appreciated even though I hoped I'd never need to use his ice melt as evidence again. The summer passed quietly. I planted flowers in my yard without worrying about whether they violated some obscure color scheme requirement. I put up a new mailbox that was exactly the height I wanted it to be. I grilled on my back deck and invited neighbors over for barbecues, something I had been too stressed to do when Patricia was in charge. In August, almost exactly a year after I had moved in, the HOA held its annual meeting. Barbara gave a presentation on the changes implemented over the past few months and the improved financial health of the association now that money wasn't being siphoned off. She also announced that she would be stepping down as president at the end of her term and encouraged residents to consider running for the board. Several people looked at me expectantly, but I shook my head with a smile. I had no interest in joining the HOA board. I'd had enough of homeowners association drama to last a lifetime. Instead, I focused on settling into my home and my life in Minneapolis. I started dating someone I met at a local coffee shop, a teacher named Rachel who thought the whole ice melt story was hilarious. My job as a software engineer at a medical device company was going well, and I had made some good friends in the neighborhood. The case had one final unexpected development in September. Patricia's lawyer filed a motion for early release based on good behavior and completion of a restitution payment plan. Apparently, Patricia had sold her house to pay back the money she owed and was living with her sister in St. Cloud. The motion was granted, and Patricia was released after serving 9 months of her 18-month sentence. I never saw her again. According to Barbara, who heard it through the neighborhood grapevine, Patricia moved to Wisconsin to live with her daughter and was working as a receptionist at a dentist's office. She was prohibited from serving on any HOA boards due to her probation conditions, which seemed like the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Life continued on. Winter came around again, and this time I was prepared. I stocked up on regular ice melt from the hardware store, nothing fancy or traceable, just standard calcium chloride that I bought in 20-pound bags. My driveway stayed clear, and nobody stole anything from my garage. One particularly cold morning in December, I was out spreading ice melt on my front walkway when my neighbor Jerry stopped by. Jerry was a retired postal worker in his 70s who had lived in Meadowbrook Estates for 20 years. "Hey, Gregory," he said, walking his ancient beagle. "I just wanted to thank you again for what you did with Patricia. She made a lot of people miserable over the years, and nobody had the guts to stand up to her." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just wanted my ice melt back," Jerry laughed. "Yeah, but you didn't let it go. Most people would have just eaten the loss and moved on. You stuck with it, and you exposed something rotten in our community. That took courage." After Jerry walked away, I thought about what he said. I hadn't felt particularly courageous. I had just been angry about being stolen from and frustrated with Patricia's tyrannical approach to the HOA. But maybe that was what courage looked like in suburban Minneapolis, standing up to a petty tyrant armed with chemical analysis and determination. The holidays passed without incident. I put up my Christmas lights, the cool white ones that Patricia had hated, and nobody fined me. I hosted a New Year's Eve party and invited half the neighborhood. Barbara came, and Doug Sanders, and even Tom from Nordic Solutions, who had become an unlikely friend through the whole ordeal. At midnight, as we counted down and watched fireworks light up the frozen Minnesota sky, I realized how much my life had changed in a year. I had bought a house, battled an HOA tyrant, solved a theft with chemical analysis, and inadvertently exposed a fraud scheme that had been running for years. It wasn't the quiet suburban life I had envisioned when I signed the closing papers, but it was mine. Tom raised his glass in a toast. "To batch numbers and justice," he said with a grin. Everyone laughed and clinked glasses. It was a ridiculous thing to toast, but it was also perfectly appropriate. A batch number had been the key to everything, the one piece of evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. Without Tom's meticulous record-keeping and the unique chemical signature in that ice melt, Patricia might have gotten away with her theft and her fraud indefinitely. As winter deepened and the temperatures plummeted, I found myself appreciating the small freedoms that came with living in a properly managed community. The HOA still existed, and there were still rules, but they were reasonable rules designed to maintain property values and community safety, rather than satisfy one person's need for control. Barbara proved to be an excellent president. She was fair, transparent, and willing to listen to residents' concerns. When disputes arose, she mediated rather than dictated. The quarterly financial reports were detailed and clear, showing exactly where HOA dues were going and what projects were planned for the future. In February, almost exactly a year after the theft, the HOA board commissioned a small plaque to be installed in the community park. It read, "In appreciation of the residents who work together to build a stronger community through transparency, integrity, and mutual respect." It was a subtle dig at Patricia without naming her, and everyone understood the message. I attended the dedication ceremony on a cold Saturday morning. The park was full of neighbors, many of whom I now considered friends. Barbara gave a short speech about the importance of ethical leadership and community trust. Children played on the snow-covered playground while adults drank hot chocolate and chatted. Looking around at the gathering, I realized that Patricia's downfall had actually brought the neighborhood closer together. We had all been victims of her arbitrary rules and fraudulent fines to varying degrees, and exposing her schemes had been cathartic for everyone. The community felt more cohesive now, less like a collection of strangers living near each other and more like an actual neighborhood. Rachel, my girlfriend, squeezed my hand. "You did a good thing," she said softly. I smiled but didn't respond. The truth was more complicated than that. I hadn't set out to reform the HOA or expose Patricia's fraud. I had just wanted my ice melt back and been stubborn enough to follow the evidence wherever it led. The rest had been consequences, important consequences, but not ones I had specifically intended. Still, Jerry was right about one thing. I hadn't let it go. When Patricia had dismissed my concerns and threatened me with more violations, I could have backed down. I could have decided that $200 and some HOA fines weren't worth the fight, but something in me had refused to accept that outcome. Maybe it was principle, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was just the accumulated frustration of months of petty tyranny finally finding an outlet. Whatever the reason, I had pushed forward, and the results had been significant. Patricia was in prison, then released but relocated and barred from positions of trust. The HOA was reformed and operating transparently. Residents had recovered their fraudulent fines. And I had learned that sometimes the smallest pieces of evidence, like a batch number on a bag of ice melt, could unravel the biggest frauds. The winter continued, harsh and unforgiving as Minnesota winters always are. But my driveway stayed clear, my walkway was safe, and my garage remained undisturbed. I bought more ice melt when I needed it, standard stuff from the hardware store, and I made sure to lock my garage every night. The story took on a life of its own in the neighborhood. New residents moving in would hear about the ice melt case from their neighbors, and the tale would grow in the telling. Some versions had me conducting elaborate chemical experiments in my garage. Others had Patricia running an international HOA crime syndicate. I tried to correct the more outlandish versions when I heard them, but eventually I gave up and let people believe what they wanted to believe. The truth was interesting enough without embellishment. A unique batch number and careful record keeping had provided incontrovertible proof of theft, which had led to the discovery of a much larger fraud. It was a reminder that attention to detail mattered, that documentation mattered, and that sometimes justice came down to something as mundane as a chemical analysis report and a receipt. In March, I received a letter from the Minnesota Attorney General's office. They were investigating HOA fraud across the state following publicity from Patricia's case, and they wanted to know if I would be willing to speak about my experience. Apparently, several other HOA presidents and board members had been embezzling funds or issuing fraudulent fines, and the state was considering new legislation to increase oversight and accountability. I agreed to participate and spent an afternoon at the state capitol in St. Paul, telling my story to a group of legislators and their staff. They were particularly interested in the chemical analysis aspect, seeing it as a model for how residents could gather objective evidence to challenge HOA overreach. One legislator, a representative from Duluth named Karen Thompson, was especially engaged. She had dealt with HOA complaints from constituents for years and was frustrated by the lack of accountability in the system. The problem is that HOAs operate with minimal oversight, she explained after the formal presentation. They can levy fines, foreclose on properties, and make life miserable for residents, but there's very little regulation governing their conduct. Your case demonstrates the need for better record, keeping requirements and independent audits. Over the next few months, Representative Thompson introduced legislation requiring HOAs in Minnesota to file annual financial reports with the state, undergo regular audits, and establish formal appeals processes for violations. The bill faced opposition from some HOA industry groups who argued it was government overreach, but it ultimately passed with bipartisan support. I was invited to attend the bill's signing ceremony in June. Governor Tim Walz signed the legislation in a small ceremony at the Capitol, surrounded by legislators, consumer advocates, and a handful of residents who had been victims of HOA fraud. Representative Thompson made a point of thanking me specifically for bringing attention to the issue. Without Mr. Walsh's persistence and his unique evidence, we might never have understood the scope of this problem, she said. His case opened our eyes to systemic issues that needed addressing. It was surreal to be thanked by the governor for something that had started with me being angry about stolen ice melt, but I accepted the recognition graciously. If my experience could help prevent other people from dealing with tyrannical HOA boards, then something good had come from the whole mess. Rachel came with me to the ceremony, and afterward we walked around the Capitol grounds, enjoying the summer weather. Minneapolis was beautiful in June, warm and green and alive with energy. We talked about the future, about her teaching career and my work, about maybe moving in together eventually. "You know what's funny?" Rachel said as we sat on a bench overlooking the city. "You solved a crime with ice melt." In Minnesota, that's almost poetic. I laughed. I didn't solve it so much as document it. Tom at Nordic Solutions did the real work with the chemical analysis. But you thought to check. That's the important part. Most people would have just assumed they'd never see their stuff again. She was right. The key had been refusing to accept the theft as an inevitable loss and instead treating it like a problem that could be solved. The unique batch number had given me the tool I needed, but I had to recognize its significance and follow through with testing and documentation. As summer turned to fall, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA continued operating smoothly under Barbara's leadership. The new state regulations took effect, bringing increased transparency and accountability to homeowners associations across Minnesota. And I focused on work, my relationship with Rachel, and enjoying my home without the constant stress of potential violations. In October, I got an unexpected call from a producer at a true crime podcast. They wanted to do an episode about the case, focusing on how unusual evidence had cracked open a fraud scheme. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to rehash the whole story again, but Rachel encouraged me to do it. "It's a good story," she said. "And maybe it'll help other people recognize similar situations in their own neighborhoods." I agreed and spent an afternoon on the phone with the podcast host, walking through the timeline of events. They also interviewed Tom from Nordic Solutions, Detective Chen, and Representative Thompson. The episode aired in November and was surprisingly popular, generating thousands of downloads and leading to several news articles about HOA fraud. I received emails from people across the country dealing with similar issues in their own homeowners associations. Some had evidence of financial irregularities. Others were dealing with board members who abused their authority. I tried to respond to everyone, offering advice about documentation and suggesting they contact their state legislators about oversight. It was overwhelming at times, but it also felt meaningful. What had started as a personal grievance over stolen ice melt had evolved into something larger, a catalyst for change in how homeowners associations operated and were regulated. By the time winter returned for my second year in the house, the whole experience felt like ancient history. I had moved on, the neighborhood had moved on, and Patricia was presumably building a new life in Wisconsin. The only reminder was the plaque in the park and the occasional new resident who would ask me about that crazy HOA lady who stole the ice melt. I bought my ice melt early that year, stocking up before the first snow. Standard calcium chloride, nothing special, purchased from the hardware store down the street. I kept it locked in my garage and used it sparingly throughout the winter months. One particularly cold evening in January, almost 2 years after the theft, I ran into Barbara at the grocery store. She was buying supplies for an HOA board meeting and stopped to chat. "I just want you to know," she said, "that what you did changed this community for the better. We're stronger now, more transparent, and people actually trust the HOA board. That wasn't true when Patricia was in charge." I thanked her, appreciating the recognition but still feeling slightly awkward about the whole thing. I hadn't set out to be a community reformer or a whistleblower. I had just wanted my $200 worth of ice melt back. But intentions don't always align with outcomes, and sometimes the consequences of our actions ripple out far beyond what we imagined. A bag of stolen ice melt with a unique batch number had led to criminal charges, which had led to HOA reform, which had led to state legislation, which had potentially helped thousands of homeowners across Minnesota. Rachel and I got engaged in March, and we planned a summer wedding. We decided to stay in my house in Meadowbrook Estates, which had become our home despite its rocky start. The neighborhood had grown on both of us, and we liked the community that had emerged from the ashes of Patricia's corrupt regime. At our wedding in July, Jerry gave a toast that referenced the ice melt incident, getting huge laughs from the Meadowbrook Estates residents in attendance. Tom from Nordic Solutions was there, as were Barbara, Doug, and several other neighbors. Detective Chen even showed up, having stayed in touch over the past year. "To Gregory and Rachel," Jerry said, raising his glass. "May your marriage be as solid as the evidence that took down Patricia Hendricks, and may you never have to solve a crime with chemical analysis again. Everyone cheered and drank. Rachel kissed me, laughing against my lips. It was perfect. Looking back now, 3 years after moving into Meadowbrook Estates and 2 years after the ice melt theft, I can see how much that incident shaped my life and my community. It taught me that details matter, that persistence pays off, and that sometimes the smallest pieces of evidence can expose the biggest frauds. It also taught me that communities are fragile things, easily corrupted by people who abuse positions of trust, but also resilient when residents work together to demand accountability and transparency. Patricia Hendricks stole my ice melt, thinking she could get away with it because she held power in the HOA, and I was just another resident she could bully. She didn't count on the unique batch number, the meticulous record keeping, or my refusal to let the theft go unchallenged. In the end, that batch number, NS 2024-473B, became the thread that unraveled her entire scheme. It proved the theft, which led to the search warrant, which uncovered the embezzlement, which resulted in criminal charges and prison time. All because of ice melt and a batch number that traced back to me. Justice isn't always swift or obvious, but sometimes it's as simple as following the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how mundane or unlikely that evidence might seem. And sometimes, standing up to a petty tyrant with a clipboard and a superiority complex means arming yourself with chemical analysis reports and refusing to back down. I never thought I'd be known as the ice melt guy, or that I'd play a role in reforming HOA regulations across an entire state. But life takes unexpected turns, and you never know when a bag of stolen ice melt will change everything. My driveway is clear now, my walkway is safe, and my garage stays locked. The HOA operates transparently and fairly. Patricia is gone, living her life somewhere else, hopefully learning from her mistakes. And I'm here in Meadowbrook Estates with Rachel, building a life in a community that learned the hard way about the importance of integrity and accountability. All because someone stole my ice melt and got caught when a unique batch number traced back to me.